Now we have case number 186-16.
So on this case, I personally don't want to move this case forward today. I would like to maybe go in and review the file. The thing that troubles me is that, so basically the complainant said that, he got arrested for domestic violence, and then for a couple of weeks thereafter, the arresting officer or one of the officers who was there started texting the complainant's wife some 50 times a day. And then in this investigation, it didn't sustain because of an inability, because we were unable to understand the content of the text messages, so we didn't know necessarily if it was inappropriate or not. But the issue I have with that reasoning is that I just don't see how, was there maybe a supplemental report written by the officer in this case? Because I think we make the argument like, well, we don't know what the text messages said, so it could have been, that the officer was seeking more information about the case, and that's not necessarily inappropriate, something along those lines. But I just don't understand how that much communication between an officer and this woman could be appropriate. Like, just logically, that doesn't really make sense to me unless there was a lot left to a lot more investigation left after, the conclusion of the call out. But it just seems like that's just such an excessive amount of communication. How could that possibly be appropriate?
Well, and at least I had a similar thought, but my thought was that there was no assessment of the calls. We don't know how many of them were from her to him, her to the officer, or him to her, or anything like that. So there's no way to know who's initiating these calls, even if you don't know the content. If we, for example, found out that 90% of them were her calling him, then that would tell us something.
Right.
But there's no understanding of why calls at all. Certainly there don't need to be that many calls. And I know there's a lot of officers who, in a DV situation, and she wasn't the victim, it was a child who was the victim. There is, why are there calls at all? There's no objective reason that you can think of that would be that many calls. So it seems to me that I wonder why the staff, and if they took a look at calls from her to him and from him to her, and if there was anything you could do with that. It seems excessive to me.
Well, my recollection is that this was actually a third-party complaint that was filed. And then the named complainant and his spouse would not come forward and cooperate with the investigation. And so the assessment is based upon the officer's statement that was taken as a part of the investigation, that the post-arrest communications, as best we could get them without a subpoena, were related to the case.
But I saw all the calls. The call sheets were there. The record of that. Is there no way to tell just from that how many are coming to the officer and how many are coming from the officer?
I would have to go back and look at. I'd have to go back and look at them and see whether.
I'm not comfortable. That seems excessive to me, and I'm not comfortable with no assessment of the calls at all, just from what we have. So if there's a way to go back and take a look at what were incoming and what were outgoing calls, that would be helpful, because it would be inappropriate. Taking the cop's word for it is not enough for me. Is that how you're feeling, Chelsea?
Yeah, I think that, and then also that, I just can't fathom a reason why that much follow-up contact would be appropriate unless we saw that there were additional supplemental reports where the officer says, I made contact with this person for the purpose of getting more information from the case. Here is what was revealed to me, with attachments of the screenshots of the text messages. Unless this officer can tie that communication to the investigation of the case, then I think that this has to be some sort of violation. It seems super inappropriate to me.
Well, I wouldn't hazard a guess about that, but I think that it would, if there's a way to know how many of the calls were from her to him versus him to her, it does seem excessive, and the fact that they're not cooperating isn't necessarily a reason not to see if you can find out more. Certainly it would not be the first time that we've seen a case where the officer was inappropriate in contact with them. And I also, there's no way to know that for sure.
Well, right, but, and I'm not going to, we're not going to prejudge based
No.
upon other officer conduct. So certainly those aspects can be looked at. And
One other question is that it sounded like, and I don't know if there was any corroboration of this or not, but the complainant also alleges that that he ran into the officer and that the officer made an admission to having done this before.
No, the officer said, go ahead and complain about me. It's not going to make any difference. That's what the guy said, the complainant said.
But didn't he also say, like, I've dealt with this exact same thing before and I was just told to stop, nothing else happened? I thought he said something like that.
I didn't see that.
Well, I just wondered, like there wasn't, that could easily be completely fabricated. But I wonder, it didn't, when I read through the findings, it didn't seem to note that we had done a search for a similar incident, which maybe we should in this type of case if there's an alleged admission to having engaged in the same conduct before. I don't know. That's something that I would think we should look at.
Well, it certainly would be important, but like I said, I think that I've seen cases, I've been involved in cases not with the police department, but with somebody who's in an abusive situation and finally finds somebody who's willing to listen to them and then calls them 5,000 times, because they're desperate. That's why it's important to me to find out how many times she called him as opposed to him calling her. So, and I don't know, it may not be possible to find that out based on the information we have, and like we're being blockaded from the rest of the information that might exist by the complainant and his wife. So it may not be any place else to go. So I'm not willing to make assumptions, but I do.
No, I don't want to make assumptions. I just think that if he's making an admission to having done this before and there's a record of that, if this were to be a second offense, then that's something that should be considered as a part of this analysis.
Yeah, it certainly
I don't
would
know
be.
whether it's fabricated or whether it's true. I have no clue. I'm just thinking that, a part of the analysis should include, determining whether or not that admission is corroborated by the record.
Okay.
I don't know.
I would just like to see if there's any way you can go any further with those calls, because you've got all the call sheets.
So,
okay, so
Do you feel like you've already done that?
I will have to go back and look at the calls again. But I think that without the cooperation of the complainant, there is no evidence to say that what statement was made or what statement was not made on which to investigate a pattern and practice on behalf of the officer. But at this point, if it's the subcommittee's recommendation, then you can vote that this be on the non-consent agenda and then have the board rule.
yeah, I agree. We send it back to answer your questions about the call, and let's get board member DeVenter the opportunity to go and review the case.
Like I said, I think we're both agreed that we don't want to work on assumptions.
Right.
But there's two possible findings of fact that could happen from this. One is that you can tell from the list or not, whether or not the calls came from her to him or the opposite. And the second thing is, he either has a record of this kind of misbehavior in the past or he doesn't. And that would be a finding of fact, not assumption. And so those would be, I think, if you could come to the board meeting with that information, that would be really helpful on the non-consent agenda, and then we'll take it from there. Does that work?
Okay.
And I give you opportunity to go review the case?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, when is the next meeting? It's really close.
May
right?
14th.
Okay.
It's on
Yes, that's enough
Valentine's
time.
Day.
It's 3 weeks.
Okay, so do I have a motion?
Yeah, to put it on the non-consent agenda
Uh-huh.
for the board to consider. And I would just like that additional information at that time.
And it is 12816, the case.
I have
No, it's
18616.
186,
Oh,
16.
okay, right, oh, that's the next one.
Okay.
128.
Okay, so do I have
Sorry.
a motion? Did you want to make a motion?
Yeah, I did that
Should
right.
we-
Just need a second.
I'll second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.